Good evening, generals, and welcome to Men Around the Führer series. On the morning of February 8, 1942, a Heinkel 111 aircraft lifted off from an airfield near Rastenburg in East Prussia. Minutes later, it exploded in mid-air and crashed in a fiery ball, killing everyone aboard. Among the dead was one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, a man whose name had become synonymous with the Third Reich's most ambitious construction projects. His name was Fritz Todt. To understand Nazi Germany's industrial might, its fortifications, its roads, and its capacity to wage total war, you must first understand this man. Fritz Todt was not a general who commanded armies on the battlefield. He was not a politician who rallied masses with fiery speeches. He was an engineer, a builder, a master organizer who transformed Hitler's visions of concrete and steel into reality. Yet his story remains lesser known than those of his contemporary, overshadowed perhaps by the very monuments he created. This is the story of Fritz Todt, the man who built the Autobahn, who erected the Siegfried Line, who commanded an organization that bore his name and enslaved over 1.5 million people. It is a story of technical brilliance and moral bankruptcy, of loyalty and mysterious death, of a man who helped build an empire and perhaps died questioning whether that empire could survive. Fritz Todt entered the world on September 4, 1891, in the southwestern German city of Pforzheim, nestled in the Grand Duchy of Baden. This was a city known for its jewelry and watchmaking industries, and young Fritz's father, Emil Todt, owned a small ring factory. His mother, Elise Unterrecker, raised Fritz in a modest but respectable household. The family was neither wealthy nor poor, but solidly middle class, embodying the values of hard work and German industriousness that would define Fritz's entire life. From an early age, Fritz showed an aptitude for technical matters and precision. Growing up in Pforzheim, surrounded by craftsmen who worked with their hands to create intricate pieces of jewelry, he developed an appreciation for both engineering and aesthetics, a combination that would later define his greatest works. The young Todt was methodical, focused, and driven by a desire to build something lasting. In 1910, at the age of 19, Fritz volunteered for 1 year of military service, a common practice among young German men of his social class. This experience instilled in him discipline and an understanding of military organization that would serve him well in later years. But it was clear that his true calling lay not in soldiering, but in engineering. From 1911 to 1914, Todt studied engineering at two prestigious German institutions, the Technical University of Munich and the Technical University of Karlsruhe. He was a dedicated student, immersing himself in the mathematics of construction, the properties of concrete and steel, and the principles of civil engineering. He graduated from Karlsruhe with a diploma in construction engineering, ready to embark on what he imagined would be a career building roads, bridges, and infrastructure. But history had other plans. In 1914, as Todt was completing his studies, the guns of August began to roar across Europe. The Great War had begun, and Germany called its young men to arms. Fritz Todt, now 23 years old, answered that call. Initially, he served with the infantry on the Western Front, experiencing the brutal reality of trench warfare. For 2 years, from 1914 to 1916, he witnessed the slaughter of modern industrial warfare firsthand. The mud, the blood, the senseless waste of human life in battles that gained mere meters of ground. This was the crucible that forged his generation. But Todt's technical skills and intelligence did not go unnoticed. He was transferred to the Luftstreitkräfte, the Imperial German Air Service, where he served as a frontline reconnaissance observer, flying over enemy territory, directing artillery fire from the air. Todt saw war from a different perspective. He understood how technology and organization could tip the balance of battle. His service was distinguished enough that he was awarded the Iron Cross, a decoration for bravery that he would wear with pride for the rest of his life. During his time in the air service, Todt was wounded in aerial combat. He survived, but the experience left its mark. Like so many German veterans, he emerged from the war with a complex mixture of pride in his service and bitterness over Germany's defeat. The Treaty of Versailles, which Germans viewed as a humiliation, the economic chaos of the post-war years, the political instability of the Weimar Republic. All of this created fertile ground for radical politics. After the war ended in 1918, Todt returned to his studies. He completed his engineering degree in 1920 and immediately threw himself into his profession. He initially worked for Grün and Billfinger AG, a major construction company in Mannheim, focusing on water power stations. But this was just the beginning. In 1921, he joined Sager and Werner, a civil engineering firm that specialized in building roads and tunnels. For the next 12 years, Fritz Todt worked as a construction engineer, learning his trade from the ground up. He wasn't just designing projects on paper. He was out in the field, supervising workers, solving problems, understanding how to manage large-scale construction operations. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on the technical challenges of road construction, specifically examining the sources of defects in building roads from tar and asphalt. In 1932, he earned his doctorate in engineering from the Technical University of Munich. But while Todt was building his professional career, he was also drawn into the political maelstrom that was consuming Germany. On January 5, 1922, a young engineer named Fritz Todt joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The party membership number he received that day marked him as one of the early believers in Adolf Hitler's movement. This was not a man who jumped on the bandwagon after the Nazis came to power. This was a true believer who joined when the party was still small, still radical, still considered by many to be a fringe movement of angry veterans and discontents. Why did Todt join the Nazi Party so early? The answer lies in the particular cocktail of resentments and hopes that animated so many Germans of his generation. He had served his country in war and seen it defeated. He had watched the Weimar Republic stumble from crisis to crisis. He believed, as did millions of Germans, that his country had been betrayed, stabbed in the back by politicians and profiteers. He yearned for a strong Germany, a Germany that would reclaim its rightful place in the world. But Todt's Nazism went deeper than mere nationalism. He was attracted to the party's vision of a new kind of German society, one that would blend modern technology with traditional values, one that would unite all Germans in a common purpose. He believed in the Nazi concept of the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, where class divisions would be overcome and every German would work for the collective good. In 1931, Todt joined the Sturmabteilung, the SA, Hitler's brown-shirted stormtroopers commanded by Ernst Röhm. He started as an ordinary stormtrooper, a remarkable decision for a man of his education and professional standing. But this was typical of Todt's character. He believed in starting at the bottom, in proving himself through work rather than through privilege. By 1938, he had risen through the ranks to become an SA Obergruppenführer, equivalent to a lieutenant general. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Todt remained active in the party even during periods when it was banned or facing legal trouble. He was not merely a nominal member who paid his dues and attended occasional meetings. He was deeply committed to National Socialist ideology. He believed that technology and engineering should serve the German people, that engineers had a special role to play in building the new Germany that Hitler promised. In 1930, Todt published a paper that would change his life. It was titled, Proposals and Financial Plans for the Employment of 1 Million Men. The paper addressed one of the Weimar Republic's most pressing problems, mass unemployment. Todt proposed using unemployed men to build a modern highway system across Germany. The proposal was technically sound, economically ambitious, and politically attractive. Adolf Hitler read this paper and was impressed. Here was a man who understood both engineering and politics, who could translate grand visions into concrete plans, who could organize large-scale projects. Hitler filed away Todt's name in his memory. When the Nazis came to power in January 1933, Hitler knew exactly who he wanted to build his roads. On July 5, 1933, just 5 months after Hitler became Chancellor, Fritz Todt received the appointment that would define his career. He was named General Inspector für das Deutsche Straßenwesen, Inspector General for German roadways. In November of that year, this position was elevated to the status of a supreme Reich authority, answering directly to Hitler himself, bypassing the normal ministerial hierarchy. This was an extraordinary grant of power for a 42-year-old engineer. But Hitler had recognized in Todt a kindred spirit, someone who shared his vision of a new Germany, someone who could actually build what Hitler dreamed. Hitler's vision for the Autobahn was grand and ambitious. It wasn't merely about building roads. It was about transforming Germany, about providing work for the unemployed, about connecting the nation, about demonstrating to the world that Germany was back. The Autobahn would be the first comprehensive high-speed highway system in the world, a triumph of German engineering that would make other nations envious. But Todt knew that visions were nothing without execution. He threw himself into the project with an energy and organizational skill that amazed even Hitler. He established a new state-owned corporation called Reichsautobahnen to manage the construction. He recruited engineers, architects, and workers by the hundreds of thousands. He developed innovative construction techniques and standardized designs that could be replicated across the country. What set Todt apart was his holistic approach to the project. He wasn't just building roads, he was creating what he called a harmonious integration of technology and nature. The Autobahn routes were designed to flow with the landscape, rather than simply cutting through it in straight lines. Bridges were built not just for function, but for beauty. Rest stops and service areas were designed with aesthetic considerations in mind. Todt edited a journal called Die Straße, The Road, which promoted his vision of German road construction from 1934 to 1942. In its pages, he articulated a philosophy that blended technical expertise with Nazi ideology. He wrote about the spiritual dimension of construction work, about how building roads was not just a matter of concrete and asphalt, but a way of binding the German people together. By 1934, Todt had succeeded in elevating his office to near cabinet rank. He commanded a budget of hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks. At the project's peak, he employed as many as 250,000 workers. These were men who had been unemployed, who had known hunger and desperation during the Depression, who now had jobs and purpose. This was part of the Nazi propaganda success story, and Todt was at its center. The construction of the Autobahn proceeded at a pace that astonished foreign observers. By 1938, more than 3,000 kilometers of highway had been completed. German motorists marveled at these new roads, smooth and fast, with gentle curves and carefully designed intersections. Some sections near popular destinations like Berchtesgaden saw 14,000 vehicles every Sunday. At the 1936 Nuremberg Rally, Todt reported proudly on the progress. He announced the completion of the first 1,000 kilometers and boasted about the international recognition the project was receiving. A leading American was quoted as saying that Todt was building the best roads in the world. Swedish visitors called the Autobahns the best automobile highways in the world. French newspapers admitted that France had fallen behind Germany. British publications suggested that England needed such Nazi roads. The Autobahn became one of the showcase achievements of the Nazi regime. It was proof, or so the propaganda claimed, that National Socialism worked, that Hitler's government could accomplish what the democratic Weimar Republic could not. And at the center of this triumph stood Fritz Todt, the engineer who had made it all possible. But there was a darker side to this achievement. Initially, the Autobahn project relied on the open labor market, taking advantage of Germany's high unemployment. But as the economy recovered and labor became scarce, Todt increasingly relied on conscripted labor. In 1935, a law was passed requiring all German men between 18 and 25 to perform 6 months of compulsory labor service. These young men, working for wages barely above unemployment assistance, built the Führer's roads. This was just the beginning. The organization and methods that Todt developed for building the Autobahn would soon be turned to far darker purposes. For in 1938, as Hitler's ambitions grew more aggressive and war loomed on the horizon, Todt's role was about to expand dramatically. For his work on the Autobahn, Hitler awarded Todt the German National Prize for Art and Science in 1937, a medal created to replace the Nobel Prize, which Hitler had forbidden Germans from accepting. Todt shared this honor with such luminaries as Ernst Haenkel, Ferdinand Porsche, and Willy Messerschmitt. He had become one of the most celebrated figures in Nazi Germany. But the age of celebration was ending. The age of total war was beginning. In May 1938, Fritz Todt took the construction empire he had built for the Autobahn project and transformed it into something much larger and more ominous. He founded the Organisation Todt, named after himself at Hitler's insistence. Few other institutions in the Third Reich bore the names of living individuals, a testament to the special place Todt held in Hitler's esteem. The Organisation Todt, known simply as OT, was unlike anything that had existed before. It was part government agency, part military organization, part private corporation. It brought together government firms, private companies, and the Reich Labor Service into one massive construction conglomerate. Its members wore uniforms, held ranks similar to military ranks, but they were engineers and builders, not soldiers. The OT's first major military project came in the crisis year of 1938, during the Munich crisis over Czechoslovakia. Hitler ordered Todt to fortify Germany's western border. The result was the West Wall, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line, a massive defensive fortification system stretching from the Dutch border to Switzerland, a distance of over 630 kilometers. The scale of the Siegfried Line was staggering. It consisted of more than 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, and other fortifications, along with anti-tank obstacles, artillery positions, and a network of interconnected defensive works. Building it required enormous quantities of concrete, steel, and labor. The Wehrmacht's own engineering corps was moving too slowly for Hitler's taste. He wanted the Siegfried Line built fast, and he turned to Fritz Todt to make it happen. Todt mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers. The OT operated with military efficiency and discipline. Engineers planned the fortifications with meticulous care. Workers poured concrete day and night. Hitler was delighted with the pace of construction, and his faith in Todt's abilities grew even stronger. The West Wall was never truly tested in major combat, but its construction served an important purpose for Hitler. It gave him freedom to move troops eastward, secure in the knowledge that Germany's western frontier was fortified. It was also a powerful propaganda tool, demonstrating German strength and determination. As Hitler's territorial ambitions expanded, so did Todt's responsibilities. In December 1936, he was appointed director of the head office for engineering in the National Directorate of the Nazi Party. In December 1938, he became general plenipotentiary for the regulation of the construction industry in Hermann Göring's four-year plan. He was now not just building roads and fortifications, he was overseeing the entire German construction sector. The Organisation Todt grew into a behemoth. It had its own administrative structure, its own system of ranks, its own internal culture. German engineers and managers joined its leadership. It contracted with private companies across Germany and increasingly across the territories that Germany would soon occupy. It was becoming the construction arm of the Nazi Empire. But as the OT expanded, so did its reliance on forced labor. What had begun with German conscripts gradually evolved into something much darker. As Germany conquered new territories, the OT began using workers from occupied countries. Initially, some of these workers were volunteers, lured by promises of decent pay and conditions. But increasingly, they were forced laborers, people who had no choice but to work for the Organisation Todt. Todt himself was not merely a technocrat focused solely on engineering problems. He was a true believer in National Socialist ideology. He worked to spread what he called techno-political thinking among German engineers. He established training courses that emphasized not just technical knowledge but also political education, physical training, and leadership skills. He wanted to create a new kind of engineer, one who was politically aware, devoted to the Volksgemeinschaft, and committed to serving the Führer. In his speeches and writings, Todt articulated a vision of technology that was distinctly Nazi in character. He spoke about the spiritual revolution that National Socialism represented, about the need for German engineers to be more than mere specialists, about how technology should serve the German people and enhance German culture. He believed that true technical progress could only be achieved by Aryans, by Germans who embodied what he saw as racial superiority. This ideology, attractive as it might have seemed to some German engineers hungry for recognition and status, had terrible consequences. It helped create a culture where engineers could rationalize participation in atrocities, where slave labor could be justified as service to the nation, where human suffering could be ignored in pursuit of technical efficiency. On March 17, 1940, Fritz Todt received an appointment that made him one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. Hitler named him Reich Minister for Armaments and Munitions, giving him control over the entire German military economy. This was an extraordinary expansion of power, and it came at a crucial moment in history. Germany was at war. Poland had been conquered in a lightning campaign in September 1939. The phony war in the West would soon end with Germany's stunning victories in France and the Low Countries in May and June 1940. Hitler was planning for a long war, and he needed someone who could organize German industry to produce the weapons, ammunition, and equipment that the Wehrmacht needed. Todt approached his new responsibilities with the same systematic thoroughness he had brought to the Autobahn and the West Wall. But he quickly discovered that managing Germany's armaments industry was far more complex than building roads or fortifications. He had to deal with competing bureaucracies, with powerful industrialists, with the Wehrmacht's own procurement offices, and with other Nazi leaders who had their own ideas about how the economy should be run. Hermann Göring, who as head of the four-year plan considered the economy his domain, was particularly difficult. Göring resented Todt's appointment and the authority it gave him. The two men clashed repeatedly over control of resources, labor, and production priorities. Todt, for all his organizational skills, found himself frustrated by the Byzantine power structures of the Nazi state. Despite these obstacles, Todt made significant improvements to German armaments production. He introduced the concept of industrial self-responsibility, creating committees and advisory boards where engineers and industrialists could work together to solve production problems. He pushed for standardization and rationalization, trying to eliminate wasteful duplication and inefficiency. But Todt was fighting against formidable obstacles. The Nazi system was fundamentally inefficient, plagued by overlapping authorities and personal rivalries. Different branches of the military competed for resources. Party officials interfered in economic decisions for ideological reasons. And above it all loomed Hitler, whose decisions were often based on intuition rather than careful analysis. In November 1939, Göring named Todt to take overall responsibility for the construction sector of the Reich and the occupied Polish territories. In 1941, he was appointed Inspector General for Water and Energy, adding yet more responsibilities to his already overwhelming workload. Todt was now responsible for roads, fortifications, armaments production, and infrastructure. No single person could effectively manage all of this, but Todt tried. The Organisation Todt, meanwhile, continued to expand. In 1941, Hitler gave Todt the task of building the Atlantic Wall, a massive system of fortifications along the coast of occupied Western Europe to defend against an Allied invasion. This project stretched from Norway to the Spanish border, thousands of kilometers of coastline that needed to be fortified. The Atlantic Wall required enormous amounts of concrete, steel, and labor. From August 1940 to May 1944, more than 17 million cubic meters of concrete were used for coastal defenses, with over 4.5 million cubic meters going just to submarine pens. The scale was astronomical, and it could only be achieved through massive use of forced labor. By this point, the Organisation Todt was employing hundreds of thousands of forced laborers from across occupied Europe. Frenchmen, Belgians, Dutch, Poles, Soviets. They were all pressed into service building Hitler's fortifications. Working conditions were harsh. Pay was minimal or non-existent. Food was scarce. Many workers died from exhaustion, disease, or accidents. Todt was directly responsible for this system of exploitation. He knew what was happening. He had created the organizational structures that made it possible. Yet by all accounts, he did not see himself as a villain. He saw himself as a servant of Germany, doing what was necessary to defend his country and fulfill his Führer's commands. This is one of the moral complexities of Fritz Todt's story. He was not a sadist who delighted in cruelty. By temperament, he was described as soft-spoken, diplomatic, even decent in his personal dealings. His subordinates called him our doctor and appreciated his lack of ceremony. He was devoted to his wife Elsbeth and their 4 children. He spent what little free time he had with his family in Munich. But this personal decency coexisted with participation in a monstrous system. Todt could be kind to individual workers while presiding over an organization that enslaved millions. He could speak eloquently about the dignity of labor while using forced labor on a massive scale. This was the contradiction at the heart of so many Nazi officials: the ability to compartmentalize, to be a loving father and a war criminal, to be a brilliant engineer and an enabler of atrocities. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest military operation in history, involving more than 3 million German soldiers and their allies. Hitler expected to crush the Soviet Union in a matter of months before winter arrived. He was catastrophically wrong. For Fritz Todt, the invasion of the Soviet Union brought new responsibilities and new problems. Hitler gave him the task of managing the restoration of infrastructure in the occupied Soviet territory. The roads and railways of the USSR were primitive by German standards, often little more than dirt tracks that turned to impassable mud with the autumn rains. The bridges were inadequate for the weight of German military vehicles. Everything needed to be rebuilt or reinforced. Todt mobilized the Organisation Todt for this enormous task. Tens of thousands of workers were sent to the east to build roads, repair railways, and construct bridges. It was backbreaking work in a hostile environment. The distances were vast. The climate was brutal. Soviet partisans harassed the construction crews, and all of this had to be done while the military campaign was ongoing. The problems in the Soviet Union went far beyond infrastructure. As autumn turned to winter, the German advance began to slow. The Soviets fought with unexpected ferocity. German supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The Wehrmacht, which had seemed invincible during the Blitzkrieg campaigns in Poland and France, found itself bogged down in a war of attrition. In late 1941, Todt made an inspection tour of the Eastern Front. What he saw alarmed him. The German soldiers were poorly equipped for winter warfare. They lacked adequate winter clothing. Their vehicles were breaking down in the brutal cold. Supplies were not reaching the front lines. The Red Army, which German intelligence had dismissed as weak and demoralized, was launching fierce counterattacks. Todt returned from his tour convinced that Germany could not win the war in the East. The logistics were impossible. The distances were too great. The Red Army was too large. Germany's industrial capacity, despite all his efforts to increase production, was insufficient to sustain a war on this scale. He did something that few Nazi leaders dared to do. He went to Hitler and told him the truth. After a meeting at Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters, the Wolfschanze or Wolf's Lair, Todt reportedly told Hitler that without better equipment and supplies for the armed forces, it would be better to end the war with the Soviet Union. Germany, he argued, could not win. The economic calculations were clear. The Wehrmacht was losing equipment faster than German industry could replace it. The human cost was unsustainable. Hitler rejected Todt's assessment outright. The Führer would not hear of ending the war, of admitting defeat, of negotiating with Stalin. Germany would fight on. Germany would win. There could be no other outcome. This confrontation, if it happened as reported, marked a turning point in Todt's relationship with Hitler. For the first time, the loyal engineer had directly contradicted his Führer. For the first time, he had allowed practical reality to override ideological faith. Whether this led to a permanent breach between the two men, or whether Hitler forgave Todt's pessimism, remains unclear. What is clear is that Todt was increasingly isolated. His conflicts with Göring had become open and bitter. He clashed with Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful secretary, over various issues. The Wehrmacht commanders, who had never fully trusted this civilian engineer, kept him at arm's length. Todt, who had always tried to stay above the internal power struggles of the Nazi regime, found himself increasingly entangled in them. He was exhausted. The responsibilities he carried were crushing. He was managing the construction of fortifications across occupied Europe, overseeing armaments production for the entire Reich, trying to maintain infrastructure in the occupied Soviet Union, and dealing with constant political battles in Berlin. The strain was visible to those around him. In early February 1942, Todt flew to the Wolf's Lair for another meeting with Hitler. What they discussed in that meeting is lost to history. Some accounts claim they had a furious argument. Others suggest it was a routine briefing on production matters. Whatever the truth, it would be their last meeting. Fritz Todt was 50 years old. He had served the Nazi cause for 20 years and Adolf Hitler for 9. He had built the Autobahn, the Siegfried Line, and countless other projects. He had risen from a civil engineer to one of the most powerful men in Germany. And now, in the freezing winter of 1942, with the war turning against Germany, his story was about to end in fire and mystery. The morning of February 8th, 1942, was cold and clear at the Wolf's Lair airfield near Rastenburg in East Prussia. Fritz Todt had concluded his business with Hitler and was preparing to fly back to Berlin. His Heinkel 111 aircraft was ready, its engines warming up on the frozen runway. Also at the Wolf's Lair that morning was Albert Speer, Hitler's personal architect and a rising figure in the Nazi hierarchy. Speer and Todt knew each other well. They had worked together on various projects. Speer had tremendous respect for Todt's organizational abilities. The night before, Todt and Speer had agreed to fly back to Berlin together, but Hitler had kept Speer up late into the night, as he often did, talking about architecture and his plans for rebuilding Berlin. Speer was exhausted. When morning came, he decided to sleep in and take a later flight. He sent word to Todt that he would not be joining him. This decision saved Speer's life. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, Todt's Heinkel 111 took off. It climbed into the clear winter sky, beginning what should have been a routine flight. Todt's usual seat was in the cockpit next to the pilot, where he could enjoy the view and perhaps review documents during the flight. The aircraft gained altitude normally. Then, just minutes after takeoff, something went catastrophically wrong. The aircraft attempted a desperate turn back toward the airfield. Then there was an explosion. Witnesses on the ground saw a blue jet of flame shoot from the rear of the aircraft. The Heinkel plummeted to the ground near the village of Wilhelmsdorf and exploded on impact. Fritz Todt and everyone else aboard, 4 people in total, were killed instantly. The news reached Hitler quickly. By the time Speer sat down for breakfast, Hitler already knew. They discussed who should succeed Todt as Minister of Armaments. Speer later claimed he was shocked when Hitler appointed him to the position. He protested that he was just an architect, that he knew nothing about armaments production. But Hitler insisted. He had, Speer thought, been planning this appointment, waiting for just such an opportunity. The official explanation for the crash was mechanical failure. A Reich Air Ministry investigation concluded that sabotage was ruled out, that further measures were neither requisite nor intended. Speer, in his post-war memoirs, noted that this wording was curious. Why explicitly rule out sabotage unless there was reason to suspect it? Indeed, suspicions of foul play began immediately and have never entirely disappeared. There were several theories. Some believed Hitler had ordered Todt's assassination. The motive would have been Todt's defeatist assessment of the war situation. Hitler could not tolerate such pessimism from one of his key officials. By eliminating Todt, Hitler could install someone more compliant, someone who would not question his decisions. The fact that Hitler so quickly appointed Speer, who was present at the Wolf's Lair that very morning, added to the suspicion. Others suspected Hermann Göring. Göring had fought with Todt for years over control of the economy. After Todt's death, Göring immediately rushed to the Wolf's Lair, hoping to be appointed to Todt's position. When Hitler chose Speer instead, Göring was furious. Had Göring arranged the assassination, expecting to be the beneficiary? Some even suspected Speer himself. After all, he had been scheduled to be on the flight, but cancelled at the last moment. He was the immediate beneficiary of Todt's death, receiving an appointment that launched him into the upper echelons of Nazi power. Members of Todt's family later suggested that Speer was capable of anything. The most mundane explanation came from Hitler's personal pilot, Hans Bauer. He suggested that German military aircraft were equipped with a kilogram of explosive beneath the pilot's seat, designed to be detonated by a pull cord in case the aircraft was about to be captured. Bauer theorized that Todt, squeezing into his seat in the cramped cockpit, might have accidentally caught this cord on a button of his boot, activating the timer. When the crew noticed what had happened, they were already airborne. They tried desperately to return to the airfield to disarm the device, but time ran out. However, other sources dispute this explanation, claiming that Todt's aircraft was not equipped with such a self-destruct mechanism. The truth is that we do not know what caused Fritz Todt's death. The evidence is fragmentary and contradictory. The witnesses are long dead. The documents, if they ever existed, have been lost or destroyed. All we can say with certainty is that on that cold February morning, one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany died in a fiery plane crash, and the circumstances remain suspicious. What is not in dispute is the significance of his death. Todt was one of the few Nazi leaders who had dared to tell Hitler that the war could not be won. His death eliminated a voice of caution. However belated and however complicit in the regime's crimes that voice may have been, his replacement, Albert Speer, would prove to be a far more ruthless and effective armaments minister, one who never questioned Hitler's decisions, who pushed German industry to produce more and more weapons even as the Reich crumbled. One cannot help but wonder what might have happened if Todt had lived. Would he have continued to press Hitler to end the war? Would he have been removed from power and arrested for defeatism? Would he have been tried at Nuremberg alongside the other major war criminals? We will never know. On February 12, 1942, Berlin held a state funeral for Fritz Todt. It was one of the most elaborate ceremonies the Nazi regime ever staged. The funeral took place in the Mosaic Hall of the new Reich Chancellery, the massive building that Albert Speer had designed to embody the power and permanence of Hitler's Reich. Hitler himself delivered the eulogy. It was an extraordinary speech, revealing in what it said and what it left unsaid. Hitler praised Todt as a master builder, as a loyal party member since 1923, as a man who had never lost the ideological heritage of National Socialism despite his technical responsibilities. He called Todt the greatest construction engineer of all times. He spoke of how Todt had elevated the status of road workers, transforming them from poorly regarded laborers into a proud fraternity. He praised Todt's social conscience, his treatment of workers regardless of their rank. Hitler also spoke more personally, revealing the depth of his attachment to this engineer who had served him so faithfully. He called Todt one of his most faithful collaborators and friends. He said that Todt's death was a contribution, a sacrifice to the National Socialist movement and the freedom fight of the German people. What Hitler did not mention was any disagreement with Todt over the war. He did not acknowledge Todt's doubts about Germany's ability to win in the Soviet Union. He presented Todt as a model Nazi, a true believer who never wavered, who died in service to the Reich. Whether this was how Hitler truly remembered Todt, or whether it was a convenient rewriting of history, we cannot say. After the funeral, Todt's body was buried in the Invalids' Cemetery in Berlin, in the Scharnhorststrasse. He was laid to rest among German military heroes. Posthumously, he became the first recipient of the German Order, a new decoration that Hitler had created for individuals who rendered exceptional service to the German people. Todt had, in death as in life, received the highest honors the Nazi state could bestow. But honors and ceremonies could not obscure the moral reckoning that Todt's legacy demanded. Fritz Todt had been a brilliant engineer and organizer. His technical achievements were undeniable. The Autobahn system he built still forms the backbone of Germany's highway network today. His organizational methods influenced infrastructure projects around the world. His ability to mobilize resources and coordinate complex construction projects was genuinely impressive. But these achievements were inseparable from the criminal regime he served. The Organisation Todt, at its peak, enslaved over 1.5 million people. Recent historical research suggests that as many as 185,000 people died while working for the OT. These were not accidents. These deaths resulted from deliberate policies of exploitation, inadequate food and shelter, brutal working conditions, and callous indifference to human suffering. The workers came from every corner of occupied Europe: Soviet prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, Jews, political prisoners, civilians rounded up in occupied territories. They built the Atlantic Wall under armed guard. They dug tunnels for underground factories. They repaired bomb damage in German cities. They worked until they could work no more, and then they died. Todt knew about this. He could not have failed to know. The forced labor system was integral to every major OT project. He personally approved the organizational structures that made it possible. He visited construction sites where forced laborers worked. He must have seen their condition, their suffering, their desperation. Yet by all accounts, Todt did not see himself as cruel or evil. He rationalized what he was doing. Perhaps he told himself that he was simply being practical, that modern war required such measures, that Germany's survival depended on building these fortifications and producing these weapons. Perhaps he believed his own propaganda about serving the people's community and the greater good. This is the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt would later write about. Todt was not a sadistic monster. He was a competent bureaucrat, a skilled engineer, a devoted Nazi who did terrible things while believing he was serving a noble cause. He could be kind to individuals while presiding over a system of mass exploitation. He could love his family while enabling atrocities. The post-war reckoning with Fritz Todt's legacy has been complicated and contested. His widow, Elsbeth Todt, was tried by a denazification tribunal in 1947. She was convicted of being an activist and beneficiary of the Nazi regime and sentenced to 2 years of labor. Most of her property, valued at $33,000, was confiscated. She survived until 1986, dying at the remarkable age of 102. Their son, also named Fritz, followed his father into military service. He became a Luftwaffe fighter pilot and was killed in action on February 11, 1944, just 2 days after the second anniversary of his father's death. He was 20 years old. In Berlin, Fritz Todt's grave in the Invalids' Cemetery became a point of controversy. For decades, it remained undisturbed, a monument to one of the Third Reich's most capable servants. But in 2007, the German government ordered the gravestone removed. The explanation given was that the grave had become a site of neo-Nazi pilgrimages, that honoring Todt with a prominent gravestone was inappropriate given his role in the Nazi regime. The removal of Todt's gravestone symbolized a broader reckoning with how Germany remembers this period of its history. Should the technical achievements of men like Todt be acknowledged, or does doing so risk minimizing their participation in crimes? Can we separate the engineer from the Nazi, or are they inseparable? These are not easy questions, and different people will answer them differently. What is clear is that Fritz Todt cannot be understood simply as a brilliant engineer who happened to live in Nazi Germany. He was a true believer, an early party member, a man who devoted his considerable talents to building Hitler's empire. The roads he built, the fortifications he constructed, the organization he created, all of these served the Nazi war machine. One of the enduring mysteries of Fritz Todt's story is what might have happened had he lived. This question has fascinated historians for decades. If Todt had survived the plane crash, would he have continued to press Hitler to end the war? Some historians believe he would have. Todt had seen the reality on the Eastern Front. He understood the mathematics of production and logistics. He knew that Germany could not outproduce the combined industrial might of the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States. He might have become a voice of realism in a regime increasingly dominated by delusion and fanaticism. But this view may be too charitable. Todt had been a loyal Nazi for 20 years. He had served Hitler faithfully through the rearmament period, through the conquests of 1939 and 1940, through the invasion of the Soviet Union. His doubts about winning the war in the East did not lead him to resign or refuse orders. He continued to work, continued to organize, continued to preside over a system of slave labor. One conversation with Hitler, however pessimistic, does not transform a loyal Nazi into a resistor. Others wonder whether Todt's continued leadership of the armaments ministry would have made Germany more or less effective in prosecuting the war. Albert Speer, who succeeded Todt, dramatically increased German armaments production through rationalization and ruthless efficiency. Would Todt have achieved similar results? Some historians argue that Speer simply implemented plans and systems that Todt had already developed. Others contend that Todt lacked the political ruthlessness needed to overcome the Byzantine power structures of the Nazi state. There is also the question of Nuremberg. If Germany had lost the war with Todt still alive, would he have been tried as a major war criminal? Almost certainly, yes. The Organisation Todt's use of forced labor was a clear war crime. Todt's role as armaments minister made him a key figure in Germany's war effort. His early party membership and rank in the SA demonstrated his commitment to Nazism. He would have faced charges alongside Göring, Speer, and the others. Would he have been convicted? Again, almost certainly. The evidence against him would have been overwhelming. Might he have been sentenced to death? Possibly, though given his reputation as a technocrat rather than an ideologue, he might have received a prison sentence like Speer's 20 years. But Todt did not survive to face Nuremberg. He died at the height of his power, before Germany's defeats, before the full horrors of the Holocaust were revealed, before the reckoning came. His death allowed him to remain, in the minds of some, a tragic figure, a talented man who served a terrible regime but who perhaps, at the end, began to see the truth. This is a generous interpretation. The historical evidence does not support the image of Todt as a reluctant Nazi or a man of conscience. He was a true believer who devoted his life to building Hitler's empire. If he had doubts, they came far too late, after millions had already died, after Germany had launched a war of annihilation in the East, after the machinery of genocide was in full operation. Fritz Todt was born in an age of empires and died in an age of total war. He lived through the transformation of Germany from an imperial power to a defeated republic to a fascist dictatorship. He witnessed the rise of modern industrial warfare, the power of technology to shape human destiny, the terrible things that can be accomplished when technical skill is placed in service of an evil ideology. He was a man of contradictions, a brilliant engineer who built monuments to a criminal regime, a devoted father who presided over an organization that enslaved millions, a man who could speak eloquently about serving the people while treating people as expendable resources, an early Nazi who believed in Hitler's vision of a renewed Germany, even as that vision led to catastrophe. His story raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between technical expertise and moral responsibility. Can engineers simply build what they are told to build, or do they bear responsibility for how their creations are used? Is it enough to be personally decent if the system you serve is monstrous? When does loyalty become complicity? These questions are not merely historical, they remain relevant today, whenever technical experts work for governments or corporations whose actions raise ethical concerns. The lesson of Fritz Todt is that technical brilliance does not absolve moral responsibility, that organizational skill can be used for evil as well as good, that the choices we make about whom we serve and what we build have consequences that echo through history. Today, if you drive on Germany's Autobahn, you are traveling on roads that Fritz Todt designed and built. They are smooth, well-engineered, efficient. They serve millions of people every year. But they were built by a Nazi, using methods developed by a regime that viewed human beings as tools to be used and discarded. Every bridge, every overpass, every rest stop carries that history. The Siegfried Line and the Atlantic Wall have largely crumbled. The concrete bunkers remain, scattered along former battlefields, slowly being reclaimed by nature or converted into museums. They stand as monuments to the futility of trying to build permanent defenses in an age of modern warfare. They also stand as monuments to the millions of forced laborers who died building them. The Organisation Todt has disappeared, dissolved in the chaos of Germany's defeat. But its organizational methods, its blending of public and private enterprise, its use of committees and advisory boards, these have influenced infrastructure projects around the world. The purely technical innovations have survived, stripped of their Nazi origins, put to better uses. Fritz Todt himself is largely forgotten outside of historical circles. His name does not carry the same immediate recognition as Hitler, Göring, Himmler, or even Speer. Perhaps this is because he died before Germany's final defeat, before the full reckoning came. Perhaps it is because engineers, even those who serve criminal regimes, are seen as less culpable than political leaders or military commanders. But forgetting is dangerous. Forgetting allows us to separate the technical from the moral, to admire the engineering while ignoring the context. Forgetting allows us to imagine that brilliant men like Todt were somehow less responsible for Nazi crimes than the more obviously evil figures of the regime. The truth is that Nazi Germany could not have waged its war of conquest without men like Fritz Todt. His roads moved the armies, his fortifications defended the Reich, His organization built the infrastructure of occupation. His ministry produced the weapons. He was not a cog in the machine. He was one of the engineers who designed and built the machine. On that cold February morning in 1942, when Fritz Todt's aircraft exploded over East Prussia, one chapter of Nazi Germany's story came to an abrupt end. But the consequences of what Todt had built, the systems he had created, the precedents he had established, these continued to shape history. The Organisation Todt continued under Albert Speer, growing even larger, using even more forced labor, building even more weapons factories and fortifications, until the final collapse of the Third Reich. The forced laborers, those who survived, carried the scars of their experience for the rest of their lives. The families of those who died building Todt's projects mourned their losses for generations, and the questions remain. How does a civilized society produce men like Fritz Todt? How does a skilled engineer, educated in the finest universities, raised in a respectable family, become an architect of atrocity? How does devotion to nation and leader transform into participation in crimes against humanity? These are the questions that Fritz Todt's life and death compel us to confront. They are uncomfortable questions, questions that challenge our assumptions about education, expertise, and moral character. But they are questions we must keep asking in every generation, lest we forget that technical brilliance without moral compass is not only useless, but dangerous. Fritz Todt believed he was building a better Germany. He believed he was serving his people, fulfilling his duty, making his mark on history. In a sense, he succeeded. His name remains in history books. His achievements remain visible. But the empire he helped build turned to ash, and the legacy he left is one of complicity in monstrous crimes. This is the story of Fritz Todt, the engineer who built Hitler's empire. It is a story of ambition and achievement, of loyalty and betrayal, of technical brilliance and moral blindness. It is a story that ended in fire over the frozen landscape of East Prussia, but whose echoes still resound today. A reminder of what can happen when we place power without principle, when we serve without questioning, when we build without considering the human cost. His epitaph might read, "Here lies a master builder who used his gifts to construct an empire of evil. Let his story serve as a warning to all who follow, that skills and knowledge are not enough, that what we build and whom we serve define us more than how well we build, that in the end, history judges us not by our technical achievements, but by the moral choices we make." The plane exploded. The master builder died. But the questions his life raises remain, challenging each new generation to learn from the past, to remember the lessons, and to never again allow technical expertise to be placed in service of such terrible ends. Thanks for watching.